Hi everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Fauxropter. Bobbie, why is it special?
Today, instead of discussing a word, we're going to be discussing a day.
And that day is National Day of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada.
So, listeners, John approached me this week and pitched an idea of recording an episode for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. I immediately said no, because it's not our place to be talking about it.
And the reason that I thought it might be a good idea is because one of the podcasts I listen to is called Unreserved. It's made by CBC, I believe. And having listened to this week's episode where they were talking about this day, I felt like it was a thing that non-Indigenous people should spend time thinking and talking about this whole issue. And one way that we could do that was by recording this episode and having a conversation between me and Bobbie, who are not Indigenous at all, but from our own perspectives. And one of the ideas of the day is to kind of reflect on, the history, the injustices and that are historical and ongoing as well.
So just a very brief history on it. This is our second National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations to Parliament. So there was 94 calls to action, and this is included in there. And like many other colonized countries, we were very, very terrible to the Indigenous people. We wiped out more than 95% of them. And out of the leftover 630 different nations across Canada, we give them nothing.
So this is one of the reasons that, and it's interesting that you use the word we, because then the question is, who is we? Who did all this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Because it tends to happen that people who are not Indigenous don't like to think about it, what's happened, and they don't like to take any responsibility for what's happened because it wasn't them who came over here and did all this stuff, which, of course, is true on an individual level, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where it stemmed from when we discussed it, because I immediately didn't want to do this because not that it doesn't feel good, but I would rather leave more space for Indigenous voices instead of more white people talking about how we've done terrible things to people of color.
Yeah.
But I also listened to that podcast and I kind of read a bunch about it to figure out what I could do to help and what I could do to be better. And a lot of it, I think, stems from the guilt that you don't want to deal with.
Yeah.
So instead of being able to help and nurture and cherish Indigenous culture, we feel so ashamed that we can't even interact with it.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. That when I was saying you feel bad, it could be guilt, it could be shame, it could be ignorance, but cognitive dissonance. And if it's ignorance, it's willful ignorance, because you have this, very, very well, if you live here, unless you literally, arrived sort of fresh off the boat type thing, which actually was the case for me at one point in my life, where you don't really know anything about this at all. But if you spend any amount of time in this country, you begin to have this gnawing feeling in the back of your mind. So then you have a choice of either ignoring it because it's like, ooh, that's unpleasant, or trying to find out, educating yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of educating yourself is finding a way not to cope with it, but to interact with it and set yourself free, but also set an entire community free that deserves to be heard, deserves everything.
Yeah. And it's not like us coping with it is not the problem.
Exactly.
Right?
But then to willfully ignore it 99% of the time, but then there's one day. Mm-hmm. And so last year, for instance, the national holiday got voted in about 3 or 4 weeks before the actual day. Everybody's immediate reaction was, do we have the day off? Mm-hmm. Instead of why the day is there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And the importance of the day.
It was very clear from the different people who were interviewed in the Unreserved podcast that I listened to that the day isn't a holiday. The idea behind the day is to at minimum reflect, but maybe also participate, interact with Indigenous people. And who knows, maybe next year, maybe we'll have a guest on the podcast who, we don't know, but like maybe we won't do a podcast and we'll go and do something involving Indigenous people and their culture. Either way, this is what we're doing right now. If I could just go back to the idea of being a citizen of the country who is not Indigenous, it gets complicated quite quickly. Okay, so, I moved here, right? I and all of my ancestors had literally no part to play in any of this, and anybody who emigrated here from anywhere could say that, and especially from, I don't know, imagine you coming from China or somewhere, right? Like, you have nothing to do with these injustices, right? And that could be especially true if you're from China or somewhere else. But I'm British, and I have to still recognize the fact that even if my own family, I suspect, having looked at the genealogy and how dirt poor we were going back hundreds of years, probably had absolutely nothing to do with any of this stuff. The reality is that if you grew up in England at any point since colonialism, you benefited from colonialism. Mm-hmm. And I went to university basically for free, just as an example, just as one example. We have nice roads, we have nice buildings, we have all kinds of things in England or in Britain that were, partially financed from extracting resources and human resources from other countries. Let's not even get into raping and pillaging and murdering that happened in lots of places that were colonized by Britain and by other countries too. Just the extraction alone, the whole purpose of setting up colonies in what is now Canada by Britain and France was to extract resources. Beaver fur, it's like a huge thing, right? Like it was so valuable that the French and the British were just vying for this resource. And there weren't that many resources, but that was one of them, right? Mm-hmm. So, in summary, as a British person, I still benefit from some of these policies of the country where I grew up that were enacted to the detriment of Indigenous people in Canada.
But as a Canadian, you benefit from them. It's not even just...
As well.
Yeah, it's not just colonization. It's the system we put in place after colonization.
Exactly.
That we just continue to benefit and steal and rape and pillage. Like... There's missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada that are ignored. There's the Starlight Tours out in Saskatchewan. There's a highway called the Highway of Tears that we kind of ignore. The last residential school only closed in 1996. Mm-hmm. After that closed, they looked into it because we're like, oh no, did we really abuse and sexually abused children? Yeah, we did. And then we sent them back to reserves with no resources. Mm-hmm. There's still not fresh water in a lot of northern reserves.
Exactly.
And then we said, well, if you want money from that, because we devoted money to it, where survivors or their kin could get $10,000 each, but they could get more if they explained the abuse and proved it. Mm. You would never have to do that. And I would never have to do that. Mm. And the fact that it's in such a recent history that I can remember it happening isn't okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And residential schools have got international attention within the last year or two. So that's kind of not news for anybody, but it's only one dimension of this whole issue, right? Where, it needs to be understood and accepted that people came from Europe to a place where there were already people living, quite a lot of people, and had been living here for thousands and thousands of years, and they basically just took all the land, or 90 whatever percent of the land, right?
Well, I think what's important is they saw more value in the skin of animals than human beings.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And of course, it was a system. So not everybody coming over here back in 1600 and something, 1700 and something was a bad person. Mm-hmm. That's the whole point of a system, is that there is systematized policies, but those policies were enacted by the governments of England and France, basically. Mm-hmm.
So I disagree with you on like
Ooh.
the system aspect. Even though you might not have had anything to do with it, you are still 100% responsible.
Because we benefit from that system back then, is
No,
what you're
because you
saying.
turn a blind eye.
Yeah, but
If
except
you
I
just-
didn't turn a blind eye because I wasn't born.
But it doesn't matter. I think everybody presently living who continues to kind of be like, oh, I don't want to deal with that, is 100% responsible. If you are not part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
Point, like,
that makes
end
sense.
point. If you are not getting out and actively trying to create change, you are not helping.
Right. Yes. And this is like what we're doing right now. Bare minimum. Like we're not,
Oh my God.
we have no pretension whatsoever that this is doing something. We're not doing something. We're just talking about something. And from a fairly ignorant starting point, right?
Absolutely. But the only, like, the best thing, like the absolute bare minimum thing that I think we as Canadians can do and anybody can do is begin to interact with Indigenous culture instead of pretending it doesn't exist.
And interact in a kind of open-minded way, right? Don't come to it with your stereotypes, right?
Yeah, well, I think that's what I grapple with is interacting in a positive way, not a negative way. I think it's very easy to have a negative relationship with interacting with Indigenous culture because of the guilt and shame that comes with it. But there's so many beautiful parts of it that I think once you start to accept the guilt, then you can see all of the beauty. Like, they're not a sad people. They're not like sitting there like, oh, this is the worst. They have like full lives and they're great lives. They just don't have access to the same privileges we do.
Yeah, it in fact is astonishing whenever I hear, because I do listen to that podcast, Unreserved, fairly frequently to try to educate myself a bit about the reality of Indigenous culture in Canada. And it constantly amazes me how positive people from those different First Nations are when they barely have a reason to be positive. You know what I mean? It's like, it's so awful and sad. And I mean, one thing I meant to mention earlier and I forgot, but I'm going to mention it now, is for anybody who sort of thinks, well, it was just in the past. I mean, I agree with you that there is responsibility that's ongoing today for sure. But if anybody's listening to this and just, again, has that guilt, cognitive dissonance, shame, whatever it is, and really just doesn't want to accept that there is any responsibility today for this by non-Indigenous people in Canada, look at what's happening right now in Ukraine, okay? Another country invaded and is trying to just wipe them out, okay? And everybody agrees that's a really bad thing that's happening, right? That's literally what happened here, and it's still going on.
Yes.
It would be like Russia won, stayed there, it's now 300 years later, and the Russians were like, well, you know, that was in the past.
But again, like, I don't think it's that far away. I don't think it's a 300-year-ago problem.
That's true.
Because we consistently, like, keep up the standard of terrible systemic racism.
Absolutely.
Every time we touch the Constitution, we up it an ante. Like, in 2005, they made a police force, quote unquote, to start finding missing and murdered Aboriginal women. They have found one murderer who still hasn't gone to jail. And they have over 250 cases, which again is a drop in the bucket because if you don't feel like you're protected by police, why would you go to police?
Yes. And also, speaking of going to jail, I don't have the figures in front of me, but we know that the figures are that Indigenous people are massively overrepresented in the criminal justice system in Canada, right? And
then on top of it, there's like barely an education system or budget. Like, we're putting no money into it. And then out of, I think, 5% of the population is Indigenous youth. Out of that, in our, like, system, it's over 50% Indigenous kids.
Yeah, who are in care, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, the residential schools have been transferred into kinder, gentler residential schools, basically. It's still children being taken away from their families and their culture.
We're perpetuating a system over and over and over again, and then turning a blind eye and being like, no, it's better now. No. And the whole reason the Truth and Reconciliation Council happened was so we would start to listen.
The truth part comes first, right? And the truth seems like very hard for people to get their heads around. And then the reconciliation is a whole different step, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. So I think we're at a real, like the bare minimum you could do is start to listen and learn. And so out of the 94 calls to actions, we've done 12 as a nation.
Mm-hmm. And that was like 8 years ago, 10 years, whenever the commission.
No, it was 6 years ago.
Okay, but there's been time to sort of get moving on that.
There's been plenty of time.
Right.
And the amount of money we've put into like dumb things. And like, I think COVID's a great example because we reacted to COVID really quickly. Mm-hmm. Like, I'll praise the Canadian government for it over and over again. I don't really care the backlash of that. But where money didn't go was into Indigenous communities.
Oh, no, I know.
And they disproportionately got sick.
Yeah.
And there was no reason for that to happen. Also, how do we react that quickly to a crisis?
That's it.
Where there's communities that haven't had water ever?
Yeah, I know, exactly. It was astonishing. I can remember thinking that at the time, in 2020, within 3 weeks or whatever it was of, March 13th, something like that, the government had committed like, $1 billion or whatever it was to subsidies and things. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, you just like were able to do that.
Well, that's
for all the white people. It's not all white people, obviously, but the people who are non-Indigenous, right? Mm-hmm. Like instantly, practically.
Well, the people that you value.
Yeah.
It just really puts a dollar amount on lives.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it illustrates how little Canadians care about our Indigenous people.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of like, solutions beyond us talking right now and trying to do the other remaining, 94 recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, what do we personally think about that?
Well, I think it's time to do something. Like, at least the bare minimum is to interact and learn about Indigenous culture. Mm-hmm. And then get involved, like, not in, like, provincial or federal government, in community government. Mm-hmm. If you look at your municipal government, there is a way that you can help and do something.
Right, exactly, because there's also recognition of territories. You kind of hear it more than you used to, and I won't make the slightest effort to say the name of Montreal in
So I think that's the point right there. You're not making the slightest effort.
Exactly.
If you learned how to say it...
And you know why? Because I'm ashamed.
But that's it.
Because I'll get it wrong, so I don't want to...
Learn how to say it.
Right.
People learn how to say your name.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, that's exactly it, right? So it's recognizing that the land... And to be honest with you, I'm really happy for my tax dollars to go to this stuff. I really want it to. It's far more important than a bunch of other stuff that the government spends money on.
But I don't think you can trust your government.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you're saying get involved at a community level.
Yeah. Even to vote in an official who's like, yep, I'm all for Aboriginal or Indigenous rights. That's not enough.
No, rights is... They probably, have rights on paper. It's like, do something, right? Like,
their rights on paper are still under the word Indian. That's
true, exactly.
So I think right there, it's another, just clear issue. In Quebec, they had the word Aberindian in, when I grew up, they were still in our textbooks.
Yeah.
And Quebec looked at it as this, huge expense to change the word.
Right.
But to change the word gives respect to a community that we, need.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And, the timing is interesting, too, because the British Crown is the signatory to all of these treaties that were originally signed, which were very disadvantageous, let's just say, to put it mildly, to Indigenous people in Canada. But I've heard this in several interviews. Indigenous people still see the British Crown as the nation that invaded, right? Mm-hmm. That settled here and invaded. There's a bunch of First Nations in Canada, but there's one nation that the treaty was signed with. And the representative of the British Crown, who's just changed, is still seen as the person who needs to sort of fix things, oddly. But except it's not odd. It might seem odd to non-Indigenous Canadians, because it's that's just, the Queen and now it'll be the King is on the money, but it's really just a figurehead thing. No, that's who signed the treaty. And the Canadian government is still just a sort of passing phase almost, if you know what I mean. It's okay, from their perspective, it seems call it what you like. We signed a deal with those guys.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the 94th call to action is to remove that we have to swear an allegiance to the British crown.
Mm-hmm.
That's the 94th. Let's take that out. Don't swear an allegiance to these very terrible, and I don't really care, racist and systemic racist people. Start thanking the people who actually produced and cultivated the land.
Yeah, originally, exactly. And who signed treaties, were actually prepared to share the land. That's the other crazy thing. It's not like they were all defeated in battle and had to surrender and had to sign a thing. That's what the French did with the British at the Plains of Abraham. No. They shared
with us.
They shared thinking it was genuinely sharing, right?
Every year we celebrate Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. Every year. And we're thanking our motherland and mother people for sharing with us and getting us through the winter. Mm-hmm. And the least we can do is think about their communities on one day.
Exactly. So, for anybody who's listening to this, I think that was the point of this episode, right? Is that we want to have a time when me and Bobbie, can talk about this and just think about these things. And yes, we're recording it the night before, but to make sure that we can release it on the day of properly. But it's the bare minimum for Canadians who are in fact, everybody who lives on this territory that is called Canada, obviously Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people as well, to really think hard about this stuff. And it's only going to start by people recognizing something.
Well, recognizing the truth of these treaties.
Exactly. I feel out of truth and reconciliation, we're barely at the truth part.
Exactly.
For most people.
Start listening to people's truths.
Absolutely. And do listen to the CBC's Unreserved podcast. There's a lot of very interesting content there, interviews with great people, young and old alike, and it's educational. It really is. It's worth getting educated about this stuff. If we can get educated about Kim Kardashian's family, pretty sure we have time to get educated about, Indigenous people here.
Really fantastic if there was a reality show about an Indigenous family that was in the same vein as the Kardashians, because I would watch the shit out of it.
Yeah. Well, maybe they'll do one.
Well, I think so. That's what I would like to end on today. That while the bare minimum is to start intaking truth, it's also to start celebrating. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever seen the show Reservation Dogs, it's not a Canadian show, but it's primarily Canadian young actors. Mm-hmm. It's hilarious and super great, and it's all Indigenous people. The entire show, top to bottom.
Right.
CBC has a bunch of podcasts and should have more, but there's one called Missing and Murdered for anybody who likes true crime. And for a book, there's a book called 5 Little Indians, which is heartbreaking but phenomenal and won a bunch of awards.
And even if Reservation Dogs is made in the US, let's face it, the First Nations of North America did not recognize any of these boundaries like America and Canada, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was hanging out with one of my friends who's from Alberta, and they're Blackfoot, and their whole territory is just now cut in the middle because of the border.
Exactly.
So it's one tribe that's acting as two.
Yeah, it's very sad. And don't think that this is all in the past. It is absolutely not all in the past. It's an ongoing tragedy, injustice. I don't like using the word tragedy because it sounds like a natural disaster. Mm-hmm. No, this was a very planned disaster.
Yeah. The most important part, I think, is to start seeing Indigenous communities in a positive light instead of hiding from them.
I agree. Totally agree. All right. Thank you for all your input, Bobbie.
Thanks for talking about Britain, John.
Thank you. Well, somebody's got to take responsibility. So please share your thoughts if you have any. Thank you for listening, and thank you for taking the time to listen today. But please go out and now listen to some Indigenous Canadians.
Have a great National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.